Hello, my name is Fred Abong, and welcome to my YouTube channel, The Savage Philosopher. If you watched my last video where I invited Gary Gomes, my Vedic astrology teacher, to come on and discuss what he saw in Donald Trump's chart vis-a-vis the future and re-election, you'll remember that he proposed that if Donald Trump avoided any major health crisis, I think he mentioned specifically a heart attack, and or avoided a outlying possibility of an assassination attempt, and if he decided to actually run for re-election, he would win based on the strength of his chart and the dasha sequence that he'd be running at that time. You'll also remember that we talked about the USA chart. Now this is from the Vedic perspective, and that there was some harmony between that chart and Trump's chart as well. So, and the bottom line was basically that things pointed in the direction of another Trump term. Since then, I had a conversation with my friend and bandmate, ex-bandmate, Dave Narciso, on an unrelated topic in some respects. We were discussing the state of affairs of music today, and we both agreed that there was something about the music of the 90s, and this is going to sound very like I'm pleading here, special pleading here for the quality of the music of the 90s and the 60s, at least, that there was something unique about those two eras, the decades, that we are not perceiving in the current climate of music. And that may just be two old dudes talking, slapping each other on the back here. But, and that's an arguable point, and I'd be happy to argue that with anybody. But really what that brought up for me was an astrological point. And this is something that I was first made aware of through the writings of Richard Tarnas, who's a well-known astrologer, scholar. And this book that he published in 2006 called Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview. And it's a very long but very good, and I haven't even read every single word of it. It's very dense. But it's basically a historical overview of the outer planet cycles. And included in that group are Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn. And Jupiter also gets thrown in the mix. Now, in particular, how that relates to my conversation with Dave was that the 60s, during the 60s, there was a conjunction between Uranus and Pluto. And if you know anything about astrology, those two symbols, those two archetypes, are all about revolutionary change, radical change, even violence in some sense, a complete overthrowing of the establishment, and especially in a conjunction. And then in the 90s, the people who were born during the 60s, especially during the, I would call the magic window between 65 and 67, maybe even 68, those people came of age in the 90s, or entered their kind of young adulthood, and kind of brought that imprinting into out into the world. And also during that period in the early 90s, there was a conjunction between Uranus and Neptune, so there was a lot of kind of overlap between these outer planet, progressively minded, big thinking, revolutionary impacts or influences going on. And Currently, though, so that got me thinking about currently, what's going on currently, and we are seeing some signs of this flavor of the 60s being revisited, and in some way, in some senses, it's kind of crass commercialism, and most recently, the Super Bowl, there were a number of ads that were kind of mining 60s icons for, trying to cash in on kind of that revolutionary thing. And while that might be kind of distasteful, to me, I thought, well, there must be something going on in kind of in the sky, so to speak, that is making that that's making that an option, I guess, and something that would be attractive. And of course, we're seeing lots of protests, a revival of the protests in a new, of course, in a new cultural setting, in a new century, really. And so I wondered, well, what's going on? And so, of course, Tarnas had already, and this is what I hadn't remembered, Tarnas had already written about this cycle coming up. And for these kind of worldwide effects of these outer planet aspect cycles, the orb is very wide, so it's very different than individual horoscope analysis, where you want very tight tolerances for orbs of planets or orbs of aspects. 15 degrees for conjunction, opposition, 10 degrees for a square, and then on the outer you can add 5 degrees on either side of that if you really want to look for the larger trend. But when I revisited the book that I just held up, there was a few just incredibly prescient passages about this period that we're in now, which is the Uranus-Pluto square, not conjunction, not opposition, but a square, which is a much more kind of tumultuous aspect. And that square on the outer edges lasts from 2007 to 2020, and we are kind of right now, and which I'm going to show you when I put up a chart in a few minutes. We are right in the kind of middle of that, and the closest that square is going to be, so we're feeling the kind of most intense effects of it. So what I wanted to do was read 2 passages that were incredibly that are incredibly relevant. And remember, this was written in 2006. Tarnas's ideas of what he thought would likely be the case during this period, this decade and a half, from when he wrote the book about Uranus and Pluto and what they would likely bring. So his words, he says, for example, the already approaching Uranus-Pluto square alignment that will extend through 2020, and this began in 2007, somewhere in late 2007, points to the possibility of a significant cyclical development of the cultural impulses and archetypal dynamics that emerged during the 1960s. Characteristic themes we have observed for this cycle in past centuries include heightened impulses for radical social change and cultural creativity, accelerated technological and scientific advance, the empowerment of progressive and reformist political movements, intensified feminist, civil rights, and countercultural activity, increased drive for freedom and autonomy at both the individual and collective level, pressure towards radicalization in many spheres of action and ideas, intensified ecological activism, and awakening of the instincts and nature in many senses, changes in the global balance of power, large demographic shifts, and the activation of mass energies and mass movements of various kinds. So if you've been at all aware of what's been happening over the last 2-3 years, Black Lives Matter, hashtag Time's Up, on the cultural scale, on the technological scale, we just had Falcon heavy. So, I mean, the list is extensive, I'm sure. I don't have them kind of ready at hand, but if you just look for them, they're there. So that's interesting, I thought. Okay. And then more specifically, and more specific to the moment we're in now, was this passage that shortly followed that previous one. He says, the developing diachronic pattern suggests that with this next dynamic alignment of Uranus and Pluto, another period of both the spontaneous empowerment of women and an intensified striving for equality and self-sovereignty is on the immediate horizon. Because the alignment is square, the potential for stress and struggle in that process is high. How are we not seeing this? But considering the clear sequence of past correlations, it seems to be altogether likely that another feminist propulsion will infuse itself into the culture, and that women will emerge from the next decade and a half with considerably more political and economic power than now. Okay, it seems like we're moving in that direction. You can never be certain how these archetypal forces will become concretely embodied, only that they will tend to do so in a way that is consistent with their character and grounded in the developing cultural context. So there you have it. 2006, using astrological principles and empirically based through his study of the trends through history, going all the way back to antiquity, how these tend to play out in world context and cultural context. So that's the first block, is the Uranus-Pluto kind of aspect cycle. Of course, that's nothing's in isolation, and there are always countervailing forces. And one of those countervailing forces that we're also going to be especially made aware of in the next election is Saturn and Pluto. He has a very long chapter on the Saturn-Pluto cycles throughout history and how they've tended to, I mean, the Uranus-Pluto square in some ways is exciting. And we think about, we kind of look back at the 60s as a time to admire in a lot of ways, even though there was a lot of you know, it wasn't all happy for everybody. There was some idea that we were moving forward and that we were better for it. Saturn-Pluto is a very different type of setup. And I'll read just some of his brief statements about how these two planetary connections tend to play out now in, again, a world cultural scale. First is, he says, the correlation of the Saturn-Pluto cycle with genocide, ethnocide, and mass killings is striking. And then he has an entire, you know, not more than one paragraph, nearly a chapter, detailing how this is played out throughout history. More specifically about how these two archetypes or these two symbols interact. He says the consistent theme of Saturn-Pluto alignment periods now in history, throughout history, was that of widespread conservative, reactionary, or repressive empowerment in precise agreement with the archetypal principles associated with these two planets. So you put these two together, you get the Plutonic empowering and intensifying, Pluto, of the Saturn impulse towards conservative reaction or repression. And then one more summation of that, these two planetary interactions. Saturn-Pluto alignments tend to coincide with radical conservatism. Throughout history, throughout the 20th century, this is just to sort of give you some idea of what often accompanies this cycle of Saturn-Pluto in aspect with one another, and just limiting this to the 20th century. And chronologically, this is again from his book. The first Saturn-Pluto conjunction of the 20th century coincided with the buildup and eruption World War I in 1913 to 1916. The second was an opposition of it coincided with a worldwide economic crisis and rise of the Nazis in the early 30s. There was a square that coincided almost exactly with the beginning of World War II in 1939 to 1941, and then most recently, or at least in the 20th century, was a conjunction, which is what we're going to be facing in 2020, between Saturn and Pluto, that took place from late 1980 through 1984, which were the Reagan years of the Cold War, and into the 21st century, bringing it more recent, we had a Saturn-Pluto opposition that coincided with the Iraq War, which followed on the heels of 9/11. And 9/11 took place when Saturn and Pluto were basically within 2 degrees of opposition. So having this in the background now, I want to shift over to looking at the USA chart and the transits, and I'm only going to be including the outer planets. And I'm going to be using the Western chart for this. So I'm using the transits overlaid over the USA chart from the Western perspective. And I'm going to kind of go back to the 60s and work my way forward to 2020 and maybe do a little speculation on what's likely to be developing over the next 2 years. So hang in there. Okay, so I have up here the transit chart of the USA in the center circle, Sagittarius rising, Pluto in the first house, Jupiter in the 7th, Saturn in the 10th, Neptune in the 9th, and I have on the outer circle the chart. This is just for just to show you how the Uranus and Pluto, Uranus here, Pluto here, starting in 1962. So this was within the orb allowed for influence, according to Tarnas and others who do this kind of mundane astrology. And I'm just going to progress it through 1 year at a time to show you how the most intense time was during 65 through 60, even through 68. So if you watch the inner circle here, you'll see the year change. One year at a time. I've got March 13th. This is just a random date. 1962, and we're going to move ahead a year at a time. So now we're moving into 1963. Pluto is now within 8 degrees roughly of, I'm sorry, Uranus is within 8 degrees of Pluto. Now we're in 63, 64, within 5 degrees, 65 within 2 degrees. Now we're really heating up here. 66, exact conjunction. 67, still within 3 degrees in March, and then 68 out at the 6-degree orb. And Tarnas talks about this kind of Uranus-Pluto revolutionary thing working its way even into this early 70s, again on this outer orb aspect. So now what's interesting is that this was all taking place in the 9th house of the USA chart, which has to do with, you know, higher ideals, religion, philosophy, politics in a lot of ways. And so it makes a lot of sense, according to the USA chart, which is, Tarnas doesn't do this. He's talking more about on a global scale, but I thought it would be interesting to look at how these transits worked if you accept this as the birth chart of the US. And it seems to work pretty well. So that's the first cycle of Uranus and Pluto. I'm going to go ahead here. The next one was, I skipped ahead here to 2007, March of 2007, and in between that period of the 60s and 2007, there were aspects between Uranus and Pluto, but they weren't the hard aspects, which are the ones that tend to create these noticeable historical shifts. But here I am in March of 2007, and you'll notice that Pluto is right on the cusp of the ascendant of the USA chart. And so this suggests that right around this time, I'm going to go ahead a month at a time here and see if it, when it actually crosses over. Okay, so retrograde, it first crosses over the ascendant, the rising sign degree of the United States chart in February, roughly the end of February or mid-February, on this day roughly in 2008, and that coincides with Obama's campaign, and so you could interpret that as the USA being ready for transformation in a deep sense. And at that time also, Pluto was in a wide aspect, a wide square within the range to Uranus. So this is the beginning of the cycle, or just after the beginning. And going ahead a few more months, you see that Pluto will retrograde back into the 12th house, and then right around the time just past the actual election of 2008, when Obama wins, Pluto returns to the first house, right over the degree of the ascendant. And so this all coincides, this whole 2009, beginning of 2009, if you're watching the center circle here, the date, coincides with Obama's first term. And it is also in a close square, moving closer by the degree. So right at this time, so now I'm going to go back actually to 2009 and see when it got. So even at the beginning of his, near the beginning of his term, his first term, Pluto is within 10 degrees, which is the square. So in March, let's see, when did it actually hit the 10-degree mark? Oh, so yeah, it was right around the time he went, he took went to the White House. That square was within that 10-degree orb between Pluto and Uranus. So this revolutionary change, right? He was the candidate of hope, which is very Pluto-Uranus. And so that was the beginning of the cycle. Now I'm going to fast forward to right now. So maybe starting at 2016, that's probably, let me see when the aspect got really close. The square actually was really tight, 1 degree back in 2015, even 2014. So beginning, yeah, really tight. 2012, within 3 degrees, within 4 degrees. So his second term basically coincided with this, the very tight square between Uranus and Pluto. And if we go up to the last election in 2016, that square is still there. We still have the kind of revolutionary change, the reforming, and so some people saw Trump as a revolutionary candidate. So we've had 2 successive candidates who, depending on your political stance, are revolutionary types. Now, you may have noticed that since 2007, Saturn has been moving quietly up to the first house. And so I'm going to bring us up to date here. And here we are, February 13th, 2018. Saturn and Pluto are in the first house of the USA chart. Still, Pluto is in a strong square to Uranus, so we're still having all this stuff that I was talking about before in terms of cultural shifts, political shifts. But now Saturn has entered into the first house, so that would suggest that the mood, the tenor of the culture and the politics in the United States would become more conservative, and all those other Saturn kind of repressive tendencies are starting to sort of become more prominent, more in play, and Saturn is in a wide, it's not in a very close conjunction, but it is moving in that direction. And before I get to the election of 2020, I want to put on the screen the 9/11 chart, just to show you this Saturn-Pluto interaction that was in play in the USA chart in particular when when the Twin Towers were attacked. So if I go, here we go, September, go right down to the day, September 11th, 2001, we have Saturn over here in the 6th house of the USA chart, 6th house of enemies, in opposition within 2 degrees to Pluto in the 12th house. And 12th house is a hidden house, things that are kind of buried in your subconscious that are not easily accessible, out of sight. And so this symbology is incredibly correlates very strongly with that incident. And if we now bring it back up to modern, or I should say current time, what we're going to see is that Saturn and Pluto are now, let me scoot ahead now. Like I just showed you that Saturn's now in the 1st house of the USA chart. The nodes are going to get involved too. Let me see when that actually happens. That's a kind of frightening. When does that happen? So sometime around November of this year, the South Node, also known as K2 in the Vedic system, transits into the 1st house of the USA chart. So now you've got 3 kind of malefic energies in the 1st house of the USA chart. And I believe Pluto is in a square. It's in a square to the natal position of Saturn, Saturn in the USA chart, which also creates a lot of all those Saturn-Pluto things I mentioned earlier. So it seems from this transit alone that things are heading in a potentially dangerous direction. If we go even further ahead, the South Node is conjunct the United States Pluto right around the time of the midterm elections, which could suggest some kind of, it could be good in some sense if you're looking for some kind of change. Pluto's getting activated there, some kind of upending of the status quo. So again, it really depends on your stance on the, or your place on the political spectrum. But the overall the overall thrust is towards that radical conservatism, and now we're going to go right ahead and look at the 2020. So really we're looking at 2019, what's going to be happening at that time. And you'll see here that this whole grouping, Saturn, South Node, Pluto, are getting very close, not only to each other, but to natal Pluto in the USA chart. Jupiter does come in to help out, but that's already in 2020. And I think it will be gone by the time of the election. Let's see here. So November of 2020, what's going to be going on? Okay, so in November of 2020, there's going to be this lineup here. Jupiter conjunct Pluto and conjunct Saturn, conjunct natal Pluto of the USA chart. You know, in an individual chart, I would know how to interpret that, but in the chart of the United States, my feeling is that it's probably not positive, especially because Pluto is being activated at 2 levels here. And the Jupiter in this case is fallen, it's in Capricorn, so it could mean the worst excesses of Pluto and Saturn here. So this kind of something, again, I don't know how this will play out, but I don't think it's going to be good. And I hate to say that, and I hope I'm wrong, but it seems to me that this period around the election and then the following cycle with Pluto, having a Pluto return here, it bodes ill for that period, and how that will play out, I have no idea. And Tarnas talks about how the kind of being specific about what people will be involved, what countries will be involved is difficult. But since we're looking at the USA chart, it seems pretty certain that the USA will be affecting our country in a detrimental fashion. And so I might have to think about that a little bit more, how that will play out. But just generally speaking, those themes of Saturn and Pluto and everything I've mentioned before, this kind of you know, intense conservatism, repression, are likely going to become more prominent leading up to that period. So you know, as Trump continues his presidency, and especially culminating around that time of the next election. So you know, I don't really have specifics to attach to this, but the overall sense, the overall flavor of this is unhappy. And like I said, I hope I'm wrong about this, and I'd like to hear from any of you who might have some other spin on this that isn't so gloomy. And I haven't really studied this, but this worries me some, and I hate to be negative, but it doesn't seem, this is a pretty significant arrangement, pile up of not good planets. And again, I completely hope that I'm missing something, and you other astrologers out there who are looking at this and maybe have some insight that I don't, please share that with me. But it doesn't seem to bode very well. And so I don't know how to what to do about it, but except to be aware that there's this potential. And so there you have it. So have a good day. All right. Thanks for watching, and I wish I had better news. And please comment if you have another take or another spin on this. I would love to hear it. And until next time, meditate on this little pile up here around the election of 2020. All right, thanks.